Don't we all want more? And don't we all want something that we feel we're lacking in some way, shape, or form? So I think one of the lessons from Emerson is that he was human and he can be a role model, but he was also feeling the lack in his life, just as we all do. And he's reaching for more, just as we all want to do. Hello and welcome. You've landed on Zero Limits Living. I'm Dr. Joe Vitale. Every week, I bring you inspiration and information to transform your life. So far, this show has become so popular so quickly, you can now see it or hear it on 1,000 platforms across the galaxy. I was going to say the world, but I think it's the galaxy at this point. I'm putting all the shows in one place to make it easy for you. You can go and binge there. Go to ZeroLimitsLivingTV.com. Now, normally when I begin the show, I now go into all the websites I want you to see, like miraclescoaching.com and my new book, Unexpected Kindness, book.com. But I'm too excited for my guest today. And because he has a tight schedule and I have questions for the man, we're going to jump right into the actual interview. Now, what are we talking about? I have a new book in my hand called Lessons from an American Stoic. And it's how Ralph Waldo Emerson, can change your life. The book's by Mark Matousek, and Mark Matousek is here. Mark, how are you?
I'm really well, Joe. It's great to see you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for making time to do this. I found your book because I'm a big Emerson fan and because I am now into Stoicism. Stoicism has become mainstream. Emerson has been with me for decades. He's been one of my spiritual guides and teachers. So when I saw Lessons from an American Stoic, I had an orgasm. I had to go get the book right then and there and devour it. And then I reached out to you and you were kind enough to say yes. So I have to begin with a couple key questions to bring everybody to the same page here. One is, what's your elevator pitch? What is your short bio? If somebody meets you for the first time, you're on the escalator, you're on the elevator, what do you tell them you do?
Well, I'm a memoirist and a teacher who focuses on using writing as a path of self liberation and insight.
Which I loved. One of your books is called Writing to Awaken,
Yeah.
which I found fascinating because that's one of the things I was thinking and teaching way back when I was unpublished and unknown. I found one of the side benefits of writing was what it did for me personally, the self-discovery that came from that. The other question that would come to mind is, how did Emerson change your life? He ended up writing a whole book, Lessons from an American Stoic. He must have done something to you.
Profoundly. Well, I
Yeah.
discovered him when I was in graduate school and I was going through a major depression and I was really lost in my life. I didn't have a sense of purpose. Nothing really meant anything. And I stumbled on Emerson at a critical moment. You know, the saying that when the student is ready, the teacher
Yeah.
appears. And that's
Right.
just what happened with me with Emerson. He was the first author I'd come across who had a cosmic, transcendental vision of the world. I
Yeah.
never thought of human life as having a purpose before. I
Mm.
came from a kind of a fallen Jewish family, a godless Jewish family in suburbia in Los Angeles in the 1950s. And we never talked about these things.
Oh,
And he
wow.
was the first person who came along who talked about the divinity within
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the fact that trusting ourselves, being nonconformist, being original, contradictory, inconsistent, the human things that we tend to resist in ourselves, he said are actually virtues.
Yeah.
So I was hooked from the first time I picked up and read Self Reliance, which is his most famous essay. I was hooked. And this was somebody I knew was going to be a major teacher for me. And he has been for over 40 years. He's gotten me through a
Wow.
lot of tight spots.
Right. I understand the feeling there. The other question I have is, how did Emerson become a Stoic? I, like you just mentioned, thought of him as a transcendentalist. And in fact, I took a transcendentalism class at Kent State University in 1972. Part of it was I was fascinated with Emerson even then. And I admit I did not understand him then.
Mhm.
I took the transcendentalism classes, and as I remember, I failed it, partly because I didn't understand transcendentalism. I don't know what the definition of transcendentalism is. And there's probably a reason why you didn't put Lessons from an American Transcendentalist as the title. and instead Stoic. When did Emerson become a Stoic?
He always had strong Stoic tendencies. He loved
Mm,
Marcus Aurelius, he loved
yeah.
Seneca, and so much of his philosophy overlaps with classic Stoicism. You know, the
Hmm.
belief in the power of the mind to determine whether we suffer or not.
Yeah.
The sense of amor fati, loving the life that you've been given, you know,
Mm,
focusing on memento mori, on mortality, and remembering our own death on a daily basis, and how
yeah.
nourishing and enriching and important that is for a spiritual life. You know, the belief in nature as the source of all our greatest teaching. All of
Mm,
these things are Stoic principles. The
right.
thing that folks don't remember about the Stoics is the Stoics had a sense of divinity, a sense of God. Now, it wasn't at the center of their philosophy. At the center of their philosophy was, how can we suffer less? How can we have fewer destructive emotions? So
Hmm.
they people tend to focus in a secular culture, particularly, on the aspects of Stoicism that are more like cognitive behavioral therapy, that
Yes.
are really about understanding our thoughts and how they work. That's very important. But there was also a strong spiritual side to Stoicism, and that's where Emerson comes in. You know, he was very, very practical, but of course, as you said, he had this sense of the divine, the sense of transcendence, the sense
Yeah.
of there being God in all things. The
Yeah.
Stoics believed the same thing. It's just not what they're remembered for.
Right. And I think what the Stoics are misremembered for and misunderstood for is the idea of, of stuffing emotions and burying feelings and not being swayed by whatever the fire of the moment might be. And it's interesting, as I was reading your book, Lessons from an American Stoic, that Emerson struggled with his feelings,
Oh,
that
yes.
he was in some ways, and correct me if I'm wrong here, if I'm misinterpreting this, he seemed in some ways to be stoic in the misunderstood version of stoicism, meaning he was restrained, that he was controlling of himself, and he didn't want to be. Do you,
Exactly.
is that correct?
That's exactly right. He was a proper New England gentleman. He did
Yes.
not want to be, but he was a Boston Brahmin. He was a seventh generation minister. He was naturally sort of a buttoned down, a buttoned up kind of guy. And
Yeah.
who he wanted to be was Henry David Thoreau. He
Right.
wanted to be this wild, crazy guy who didn't care what people thought, who
Yeah.
didn't, you know, who didn't drink or smoke and didn't obey any of the sort of social mores. And that's who he wanted to be. That's not who he was temperamentally.
Yeah.
Temperamentally, he did tend to be a bit stoic in the sense that he repressed his feelings, stoic lowercase s
Yes.
in the kind of colloquial sense. But
Yes.
we have a big misunderstanding about Stoicism, and that's why I'm so glad it's having a renaissance now.
Mhm.
You know, Stoicism isn't about repression, it's about in understanding.
Mm.
It's about reflection on emotions. It's not anti-emotion. It's simply understanding that when emotions run our lives, when we lose mindfulness, when
Mhm.
we lose balance and a sense of perspective, we suffer, and
Mm.
no one wants to suffer more than we already do. So that's really where they put their focus was on the practical that practical dimension of Stoicism, and Emerson was behind that. You know, he was
Yeah.
somebody, as you said, who had a lot of personal difficulties. He was very insecure, very self-conscious. He had trouble with emotional connection. He
Mhm.
had a lot of loss in his life. He lost his
Yeah.
dad when he was just a little boy, and then he lost his first wife
Yes.
at
Yeah.
19 when she was 19. Then he lost his son, his namesake, when his little boy was 5 years old. He had a lot of suffering in his life. And Stoicism, the classic Stoicism, gave him an emotional framework
Mhm.
with which to mitigate, navigate his own difficulties.
This is fascinating because he ends up being a complicated person. We're probably all in the same boat here, but he ends up writing about enthusiasm being one of the tickets to success. And you talk about it in your book in the latter chapters there. And yet at the same time, he doesn't feel he's enthusiastic. He's saying,
Enough. He never felt like he was enthusiastic enough. Really, enough is the key word. The truth is, he had plenty of enthusiasm, but it was never enough. He always
I
wanted
see.
more vitality. He wanted to be more kind of unbuttoned and
Yeah.
abandoned than he was. And he
Well, then
used
he's just like all of us.
to.
Don't we all want more? And don't we all want something that we feel we're lacking in some way, shape, or form? So I think one of the lessons from Emerson is that he was human and he can be a role model, but he was also feeling the lack in his life, just as we all do, and he's reaching for more, just as we all want to do. That's
That's honestly, Joe, that's what hooked me on Emerson. You know, there are
ah,
a lot of great writers in the world. There are a lot of great philosophers. He was so human and so
yes,
vulnerable, so open about his own weaknesses and
yes,
limitations and faults. When you read Emerson's journals, your heart
mhm,
breaks because there's so much poignancy in his struggle. So for me, the fact that that teaching came out of that flawed,
yeah,
inconsistent, difficult man is what really inspires me. That if it's possible for Emerson to
yeah.
tap into that depth of wisdom, someone who is in that much torment, it really is possible for all of us.
We all have a chance.
Yeah.
We all have a shot. One of the most shocking things about Emerson's life early on, because you mentioned the losses he had in his first wife, who was 19, I think, when she died. And again, this story is so shocking and revealing that I need you to confirm it for me. And that is the idea that when she died, he spent, I think, a year grieving, going to her gravesite virtually every single day. And then in one amazing, inspired Twilight Zone moment, he digs up her grave. Is that
That's
all correct?
That's exactly what happened. He was at the end of his rope. He didn't know what else to do. He couldn't pull out of this depression. He was really suicidal. He felt lost in his work. He had lost his faith. So one day he went to Mount Auburn Cemetery and he opened her tomb
Wow.
because he realized that until he looked at her face, until he actually saw her dead body with his eyes, until he confronted his greatest fear, he wasn't going to be able to snap out of this depression. You know, depression, as everyone knows, is an unwillingness to feel. So
Yeah.
there was this way that he was held in this numbness, kind of paralyzed, unable to crack through and really grieve. And seeing her corpse is what helped him finally crack. And even though he doesn't talk about it, he says that in one line in his journal, he said, "I opened Ellen's tomb today." He doesn't say anything more, but it's clear that there was a major effect afterward. He quit the ministry. He started writing. He went to Europe and met some of his great literary heroes. He met another woman. He created a lot. It served the purpose that it was meant to, and he had to get there in a pretty gruesome way.
Edgar Allan Poe would have been proud of him,
He
and and so would Rod Serling. It would have been a great Twilight Zone episode, and Vincent Price. All of these guys come to mind because I'm thinking of opening the coffin. Talk about shock therapy, Mark. I mean, this is self-induced shock therapy.
It is, but it's not without precedent. You know, there's a long tradition of Buddhist
Mm,
monks meditating in charnel grounds, meditating among the skeletons and the corpses and the skulls as a
yeah,
way of reminding themselves of impermanence.
yeah,
And what that does is it wakes us up to the
mm,
reality of this experience that we're having. So he was really following in that tradition of
I
really
see.
looking impermanence in the eye, because there's
Yeah,
something in the mind that we reflexively pull away from
yeah,
the things that will actually wake us up. And
yeah,
so what Emerson was doing was deliberately going toward his fear. And that's what he tells us to do in all of his writing. Always do what you are afraid to do, he says. And
yeah.
that's what wakes us up to the reality of the moment.
It is just an amazing story to have it confirmed by you. It's sending chills up my spine. The fearlessness that it took for him to do this. It's a solitary experience. Nobody is with him when he opens that gravesite or the
Right.
coffin, and he's looking at his wife now a year later after her passing. It just boggles the mind here. I'm thinking of the people who have died in my life. I don't know if I can get to the point of digging their grave up so I can look at that to face some reality about death. This brings up all kind of questions, and I think the thing maybe to focus on so we can help as many people as possible is the issue of fear. Because in your book, Lessons from an American Stoic, and I love the book, I encourage everybody just to drop everything, forget this show, go get the book and start reading it. One of the lessons is about fear. And I don't remember it being focused on the gravesite experience that he just went through and we just described, but the whole idea about facing our fears and owning up to them. What are some insights that you got as you studied Emerson and thought about this whole aspect of fear in the everyday human experience?
Emerson's path to awakening is all about facing the shadow, what we today call the psychological shadow.
Yeah.
That's not only your fear, but it's your guilt, it's your shame, it's your regret, it's your insecurity, it's your disappointment. Until we open up our minds to the dark side of the moon, to the dark side of our own psyche, we can't be whole human beings. It's really like trying to balance on one leg. We really have to enter what he called the house of pain, to know what's there so that we are full, spiritually mature people. Otherwise we can't have empathy for others. And we're living in some fantasy land of invulnerability.
Yeah.
So whatever it is that opens us up to our own vulnerability, to our humanity, to our inconsistency, which is another big theme in Emerson. Inconsistency. I had never heard anyone before, a philosopher, say, bless your inconsistency, bless your contradictions. Yeah, as he said famously, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds.
Yes.
So to be consistent, to kind of try to be monolithically strong or good, and to deny the parts of ourselves that are broken, is to miss that wisdom, and really to miss the opportunity of growing into your full humanity, which is paradoxical. We're walking paradoxes.
Right. And we want to walk in the other direction. We don't want to go into the house of pain. Why is Emerson urging us? Why did he even do that? Why would he want to go into the house of pain? We're talking about Stoicism, and you mentioned Marcus Aurelius. I'm a big fan of Seneca. Seneca's letters were like they were written to me. They're so clear, they're so easy to understand, and they're so practical. But one of the other competitors, so to speak, was Epicurus. Epicurus was more interested in friendship, but not in suffering. He was more into avoiding suffering. He was more into, to use what I think is the traditional understanding of Epicurus, relishing the moment and going for the comfort of life. Then we got Seneca, and I might be wrong about this, so if you know, correct me. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Emerson, all going in the direction of let's walk into the house of pain. Why?
It's a deeper path. It's the same reason that the Buddha had to leave the palace and go out in the street and see the corpse and the dying person and the old person, to begin to wake up to the Dharma and the truth about our existence. It wasn't by only focusing on what gives us pleasure and comfort. There's a point to doing that. We can't forget joy, but paradoxically, I'm sure you know this, the closer you get to the darkness, the more joy you're able to feel. That it's when we take things for granted that we actually stop feeling joy.
Yes, yes. Well, one of the other lessons in your wonderful book is about awe. Awe, A-W-E. Awe is one of my favorite words. It's one of my favorite experiences. Why is that a lesson from Emerson? How did that weave in? We're talking about the house of pain, and somehow we have another lesson about awe.
Well, we are filled with awe, not only before things that are pleasant, but also before things are unpleasant. Awe is whatever takes us outside our ordinary way of seeing. The definition of awe is that it's something that your existing mental structures can't contain. That can be something beautiful, extraordinary, sublime, or it can be something awful, like 9/11. People were awed in that moment. But what awe does is it stops the mind. It changes us cognitively. And Emerson understood that. And all the way through his writing is this teaching to pay attention to the glory of the moment and to see that what the mystics would call bliss or satori is available to us at every moment in the smallest things. And it doesn't have to be big, extraordinary occurrences. One day there's a great story about Emerson visiting this old woman, Mrs. Roch, I think her name was. He just had tea with her, and something about the light in the room and her hair and her little wrinkled hands or whatever. She left the room and he went into a state of bliss. He went into this extraordinary state. And there's a beautiful passage in his journal about the fact that this light is streaming in at us at all times, but we're not aware of it. And what we have to do, and what happens in moments of awe, is that we become aware of the expansiveness of creation. And that's what blows our minds. That's what wakes us up. And that's what makes life worth living.
This is fascinating because you said the awe can come from the great ecstasy of something, but also the great, I'm going to use the word misery of something. When
Yes.
I first read the story about him going to the grave, opening the first wife's grave, and so forth, that was a sense of shock to my system. I
Yeah.
hadn't thought about it in terms of awe, but it does fascinate me in a way that I might describe as awe.
Yeah.
So if this is to stop the mind and this is to bring us into a state of, I don't know, heightened awareness, what's the purpose of awe? It's stopping the mind, whether it was a miserable experience or an ecstatic experience. My mind is now stopped. I'm in a state of awe. Why? For what reason? For what is the point? What am
The
I
point
seeing? What am I
the
feeling?
point is
What
the
would
point is
Emerson?
that you have a lot more space in your consciousness
Hmm,
for reality and the
hmm,
truth of things as they are.
hmm.
Whatever wakes you up is grace. Sometimes grace is savage. Sometimes grace is fierce. Sometimes grace is lovely and blissful and sweet. Uh,
Wow. Yeah.
but it's the same. It serves the same purpose. It shakes you up out of your everyday trance.
Yeah.
And Emerson is all about shaking us up out of our trance. Pay attention. He said, lift up your hands in astonishment, before you're taken out of this world. We're here for 5 minutes. And we live in this delusion,
Right.
this hallucination of same old, and how ordinary everything is. If we could wake up for a minute every day to how miraculous this experience is, we would all walk around in a permanent state of awe.
That is so beautiful, Mark. That is beautiful wisdom coming through you, and I'm feeling it. I'm sensing it. There's a few things that were in your book that I don't remember reading in any of Emerson's stuff. And to show you I'm an Emerson fan, I don't see if you can. I don't know. I don't think you can see the top shelf of my books. It's a complete collection of Ralph Waldo Emerson, including it was done by his grandson, including letters that he wrote that are in the book. I mean, the actual letters, page from the notebooks in the book. So Emerson and I have had an awesome re- relationship for some time. But one thing that was in your book was the whole concept of Emerson saying we're born on a stairway, on a staircase. I
Mhm.
love the image because he's saying we don't know where we came from. And I can see that. I'm looking down the staircase. I don't know where I came from. We
Mhm.
don't know where we're going.
Yeah.
I can look up the staircase and it's like, well, it's going someplace.
Yeah.
And I get to walk a few steps.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the significance of that? Why did he use that image? He didn't have an elevator back then. So he's using the staircase, and we don't know where we're coming from. We don't know where we're going. What do we do with that? What did Emerson do with that?
You live in unknowing. You live in mystery. He says that the angel who poured the elixir of forgetting before we were born poured it too strong, so we forget who we are, we forget why we're here and what we're
Yeah.
doing. And that's part of the miraculousness of being alive, is how little we know.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, it sounds counterintuitive because, of course, we want control and we want to be authorities and we want to know
Yes.
everything. But the fact that we
Yes.
don't know opens us up to a whole different way of living. What the Zen Buddhists call beginner's mind. That
Mm.
beginner's mind, where you're walking around in genuinely uncertain of who you are and why you're here, and to live with that awareness changes the quality of your experience. You don't take yourself or other people for granted, and you're able to meet your experience and your sensations anew, freshly, the way a child does with
Yeah.
beginner's mind. And
Yeah.
that's what that passage is all about. It's about recognizing the mystery, recognizing how little we know, which is humbling, it's awe-inspiring, and it also gives you gratitude. It
Yeah.
gives you gratitude for the experience of being here at all. And that's something that
Gratitude.
Emerson talks a lot about, learning to
Yes.
really relish this
Mm.
this precious human incarnation.
Hmm. Well, as you know, Emerson has been in the self-help movement for a century or more. I mean, he is quoted, he is referred to, he is considered one of the role models in self-help and self-improvement. But I can't help but wonder, after, especially after reading Emerson and then reading your book, Lessons from an American Stoic, would he want to be in that group? Because there's magical thinking in that group. I don't know what he would have thought of the movie The Secret. I don't know what he would have thought of the law of attraction and creating your own reality. I know from your book that in part because of our thinking and as the nature of human beings, and he used the word men, because that's what he was writing about and writing too, that we have the ability to influence reality, but I don't know about controlling it. I don't know if I'm asking a clear question or not, Mark. What I'm trying to bring up is Emerson is considered to be a self-help teacher. He'd be like Tony Robbins today or some of the other teachers that are out there. But would Emerson agree to that? He seems to be part create your own reality and part give in to current reality.
Believing Before Seeing, a new book by Candace Bard, teaching you how to believe into existence. Available now for pre-order.
No, he wouldn't subscribe to a lot of what goes under the rubric of self-help now
Yeah.
in terms of magical thinking and the charlatans and the selfishness, the narcissism of so much of that movement. But self-help itself was something he completely embraced, because
Ah,
self-help historically was connected to philosophy. There was no separation between self-help and philosophy. And the idea that someone would look down on self-help because it was somehow in some kind of an inferior form was completely foreign to him. He
ah,
wanted to be a self-help author. He wanted to bring light to the darkened lives of men. That's all he ever cared about. Really, it was very singular in his purpose.
hmm,
But there are fantastic passages, particularly in the journals, around the kind what we would call the New Age.
mhm.
There was a circus in his time too of people who were claiming all kinds of strange powers, and he was pretty funny about that. He had nothing but kind of amused contempt for for the egotistical approach to spirituality that
Mm,
passes for
mhm.
self-help. Uh,
Yeah, well, let's define that for a second because you began by talking about what fascinated you with Emerson, and part of it was he was the first in your life to talk about the divinity within or the God within. And it is stretched in the public today through some of the self-help books, materials, and all the stuff that's out there to be something where you are God. But that's not where Emerson was coming from, as I understand it. He was coming from a variation of it, and it's been stretched to a degree that I'm not sure he would understand or agree to. Does that make sense? Is that
Complete. Yeah,
correct?
that's exactly right. He when he says know yourself a man and be a god, he's not saying you are God. He's saying you are a channel of God. You're a
Beautiful,
vehicle of God.
beautiful.
You're a
Yeah,
manifestation of the divine.
yeah.
What the New Age does, and what a lot of this self-help stuff does, is it confuses the ego
Yeah.
with the divine self.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
ego tries to co-opt the divine self as being
Mm,
part of itself, as being sort of its own doppelganger, but it's not. That's known as spiritual materialism. When we take our spiritual longing and we just apply it to our worldly desires,
yeah.
or we tell ourselves that we're on a spiritual path, but what we're really doing is building up our sense of self as such a spiritual person. That road leads nowhere. Uh, and Emerson was very conscious of that, particularly because people tried to build him up and put him on a pedestal and turn him into a saint. He was the first person to say, "Look, I am not a saint,
Yeah.
and either are you." But we do have the ability to wake up and be our most original, authentic, vital selves.
Yeah.
That's really what he was all about. It wasn't about saying that you were God in that kind of blasphemous way.
Yep. Yeah. No, well said. I understand. You said spiritual materialism, which raises the question, how is he with materialism itself? So, in other words, he had a family to take care of.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of people have always thought money is the root of all evil. Where was Emerson with his relationship with money, materialism, wealth,
Yeah,
compensation?
he had no trouble with earning money and being a householder. He wasn't particularly materialistic, and he could be a little bit puritanical when it
Hmm.
came to his physical pleasures. He was a man of his time and of his breeding. So there are things in Emerson that you read, you just shake your head. He had some very antiquated ideas. So a lot of them constellate around the body. He was very ambivalent about the body and the and sexuality, and he didn't really understand it. And he had a bit of, he had some moralism there. And I think it really interfered with his intimate life.
Yeah.
He was not a perfect man. He was a profoundly gifted and wise genius of a person. He was not a perfect man.
Yeah.
So he had some antiquated ideas about women. He had some antiquated ideas about racial things. He just didn't understand. He evolved and he came to understand, but there were things in the beginning of his life that he didn't. And this goes back to your question about materialism, because he had a real ambivalence. He had some of that leftover puritanical thing about God and mammon and God, money potentially being the root of evil and materialism being the root to unhappiness. So he was a work in progress in that area.
Well, you said he was a product of his times, and I guess we all are. We'll look back, or somebody's gonna look back at our biographies and go, "He believed what?" But it would be because of the time period. Now, one of the great things about your book, Lessons from American Stoic, and again, I'm urging everybody to just go get it, is that you bring in contemporary stories about people who have applied a lot of the different lessons. And one of the ones that really stood out for me was the blind photographer. Can you talk about that for a moment? Who is the blind photographer? How is that possible to have a blind photographer?
His name is John Dugdale. He's one of the most extraordinary people I have ever met. And he's somebody who's been through every known AIDS-related condition. And he finally lost his sight to CMV retinitis. And he said that, he said, I can either lay down and die right now, or I can go out, kind of holding on to my tripod and trying to take a picture. So instead of giving in and giving up, and he went through a deep depression and grief for close to a year, he realized he just couldn't live that way. And what he did was invented a new way to take pictures. Amazing. So he has a sliver of sight. So he was able, with an assistant, to work with a big box camera, I think it's a late 19th century camera, one of those old cameras, and develop a whole different way of taking photographs. And what happened, Joe, is he went from being a well-paid, very respected commercial photographer to being a world-class artist. And since he lost his sight, he's had over 40 private shows internationally. And he created a kind of work that had never been done before. And he did it because he couldn't do anything else. And this is a big lesson that comes from Emerson around using your limitations to find your own originality. And Dugdale has done that. The work is extraordinarily beautiful. And he's one of the most heroic, strong people I've ever met. It's a very moving story.
I'm in awe of what a line you just said, using our limitations to find or create our originality.
That's it.
Using our limitations. That is so profound, Mark, because so many of us, we don't want to own our limitations, for one thing. We don't want to talk about our limitations, but to actually move into accepting them and then saying there's something good in them, and maybe there's an opportunity in them. That's a mind-blowing, profound insight.
And you see it in the careers of all the great artists. I mean, Van Gogh painted the way he did because he had that inner ear disease. Beethoven composed the way he did because he was deaf. Yeah. It's not in spite of, but it's because of their limitations. These people are so unique. When I first came to New York, I worked for Andy Warhol. I was an editor at Interview Magazine. Wow. Talk about people who use their limitations. He couldn't draw. He was antisocial and shy to the point of muteness. Wow. He was not physically. He had a lot of issues with his own body, and he turned all of those things into advantages. He created a kind of work where he traced and colored in because he couldn't really draw. He developed that kind of monosyllabic thing, so that people thought he was so mysterious because he really had nothing to say. And then he started wearing those wigs, those fright wigs, to cover up his baldness, and it became a trademark. So he used everything that could have stopped him. He used as a way to become more unique.
That is so fascinating. This is amazing. A couple of stray questions or random questions I've been wanting to ask after I was reading your book. And one of them is about Emerson on the lecture circuit. A lot of people don't know that the lecture circuit, especially in the 1800s, saved the butt of a lot of people who were struggling. I wrote a book on P.T. Barnum, the circus giant. He went bankrupt at one point. He got his money back by going on the speaking circuit. Mark Twain, I'm a big fan of Mark Twain. Everybody thinks of his books. He made more money on the speaking circuit. At some point, Emerson went on what they called the lecture circuit at that point. Why did he go on the lecture circuit? Was there a motivation or an opportunity that was happening at that point?
Well, because when his wife died, he lost his faith. He lost his traditional faith. He realized he couldn't be a minister anymore. So he, in good conscience, he gave up his ministry. He had to make a living.
That's what it was.
He
Yeah.
wanted to write. So there was something called the Lyceum Circuit, where, as you're saying, people could make a good living. And he became a journeyman writer and a journeyman speaker because he needed to support himself. But it was a blessing in disguise, because it gave him the opportunity. First of all, it freed him to talk about anything he wanted to in his own way. You know, when he took off the collar and he was no longer a religious figure, he could talk about anything. His work exploded. And he was also able to touch people in a way that wasn't it wasn't limited by the hierarchy of the church and the strictures and traditions of the church. It gave him his voice as a writer and as a speaker. So it was actually a tremendous blessing for him. It served him well. He did it for over 50 years.
That's amazing. So amazing. If we only had iPhones and voice recorders during that time period. Oh, when I invent a time machine, I'm going back and get some Emerson material for you. A couple questions in the few minutes we have left here. One of them is, when you were doing your research and you were coming up with all the lessons, 4 lessons from an American Stoic, was there a lesson that really surprised you as you were diving into this research on Emerson and really making it yourself one with him and his spirit? Was there a lesson you thought, oh, I didn't know that, or it surprised you, shocked you, or you were in awe as a result of it?
I was really in awe of his writings about grief, actually. There's a chapter in there, a lesson about adversity and facing adversity. Emerson's insights into grief were really radical and might rub some people the wrong way.
Oh, tell us, give us an example.
He believed that emotional losses belong to the exterior life, as opposed to the interior life. And so that while obviously one loves, one grieves, when there's loss, there's pain. He didn't deny any of that. What he said is that it doesn't touch the spirit. It doesn't touch the soul. Pain doesn't touch the spirit. Yeah. And he has a beautiful passage where he talks about losing his son. He said, this was the most dear being in the world to me. It was unimaginably painful, and yet something in him emerged unscathed.
Yes.
And that touched me because I've had that experience.
Yeah.
Of going through tremendous loss, tremendous pain, fear, whatever it happens to be, and feeling that there was something in me that was completely intact, that hadn't been touched. And Emerson articulates that in a way that I had never heard before.
That is so beautiful. I'm glad that you shared it too, because there's spiritual wisdom in what you just said. Another question here before we have to leave. You knew I was going to interview you. What was the question you were hoping I would ask? Are you rubbing your hands together and saying, oh, I hope Joe asked me this because I'll have a chance to really once and for all answer it? Was there a question you were hoping I would ask?
I was hoping that you would ask me about what transcendentalism is and how it's different from Stoicism and why we need it today. That's why I wrote the book. We need this medicine today. We have lost our way as a country and as a people. We're in bad shape. And a big part of why we're in bad shape is exactly what Emerson was warning about 150 years ago, which is that when we lose our spiritual foundation, there's disaster is bound to happen. And we have lost our spiritual foundation as a people. I'm a great believer in science. I'm not a religious person, but secular materialism is not is not sustainable as a way of living unless we start to factor in the sacred and God, the divine, transpersonal, whatever you want to call it, into the way we live, we're not going to be able to turn this ship around. We're never, people say, why can't we talk anymore? Because we've lost a sense of there being an underlying unity to us as a species. And that's exactly what Emerson is talking about. And that's why we need to remember these spiritual values today.
Yeah. And what is your one-line definition of transcendentalism?
Transcendentalism is the understanding that we each have direct access to the divine, to the metaphysical, however you define that. And that connection is the most important relationship in our lives.
Off the wall question. What do you think Emerson would say about the state of the world as you and I see it in this point in time? And I'm asking for an imaginary answer, but you're one with Emerson in spirit because of the research here. And in many ways I am too. What comes to mind would be his commentary on the state of the world today. Ralph Waldo Emerson says,
he would be appalled. He really would be appalled. Someone asked me this the other night in a reading, how Emerson would feel about social media. He would look at our addiction to externals, our addiction to other people's opinions, this obsession with being liked or being stroked or being winked at or being approved of, with horror. It's antithetical to self-reliance. The more we're looking outward for confirmation of our worth, the less worth we have. And so he would be very worried. He would not be happy. Yeah. And I think that he would have a lot of judgment about a lot of what he would see as superficial attachment and concerns in the way that we've created this culture.
My final question for you, Mark, and thank you for playing along with all of this, especially the spontaneity of these final questions. You meet Ralph Waldo Emerson. You present a copy of your book to him. What is the one question you would like to ask him? You've done all of this research. Is there something that's been on your mind, perplexing, curious? What would you ask Waldo when you have the chance?
I'd ask him why he was so afraid of love. What was it about love, opening his heart, sharing his body? What was he hiding? What was the thing that he was, for all of his wisdom and his depth, what was he protecting in himself that he was never able to transcend? On a human level, that's what I would want to know.
Yeah. On a human level, that's implying there's another level you would ask?
I think there is.
What's the other one?
Well, the other one is I would want to know more about his mystical experiences. Yeah. Because he was not a closet mystic, but most people, people don't think of Emerson as a mystic, but he was a raging mystic. So I would really like to know about how it felt to be him, particularly as he aged. He became more and more of a sage. How did that feel? What did he leave behind? And how did, the famous passage about when he says he became like a transparent eyeball. Yeah. He was walking along the street and he looked down and he saw the sky reflected in a puddle or something. And he said he suddenly felt like he was looking through the eyes of God. I want to know more about that. I want to know more about how that felt for him.
And I want to know more about you and your work. So I'm going to have you back at some point. Mark Matousek, who wrote Lessons from an American Stoic. It's in all the bookstores, How Emerson Can Change Your Life. Mark, thank you very much for making time to do this. I'm very grateful. And in many ways, I'm very much in awe of you, the book, and of course, Emerson.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here.
You've been watching Zero Limits Living. Every week I bring you inspiration and information to transform your life. You can see all the episodes at ZeroLimitsLivingTV.com. I want to thank Lux Media Studios, Candace Barr, Nick and Chris in the engineering, and all of you for watching this. You're the ones that are bringing light to the world. Expect miracles. I love you.